You see, the narcissist walks through life wrapped in an illusion carefully constructed, meticulously maintained, and ruthlessly defended. This illusion says, I am above consequence. I am the center. I control the narrative, the relationships, the outcomes. And for a while, this illusion works. People bend, submit, accommodate, give the narcissist what they want, whether out of fear, love, exhaustion, or simply the need to avoid conflict. But eventually, a critical point emerges. You, the one who perhaps once accommodated, begin to change. Maybe you wake up to the manipulation. Maybe you reclaim your self-respect. Maybe you simply outgrow the space they confined you to. Whatever the reason, something shifts. And here's the part that cuts deepest. The narcissist doesn't notice at first. They are so absorbed in their own grandiosity, so convinced of their supremacy, that they fail to perceive the small, almost imperceptible cracks forming in the foundation of their power over you. When the narcissist finally realizes you are the one they can't live without, it's not a gentle realization. It's not a moment of tender epiphany where they sit down and reflect with mature sorrow. No, it's a shattering. It's a violent rupture inside their psyche, a confrontation with their own limits. Because remember, to the narcissist, you were supposed to be replaceable. You were supposed to be interchangeable, just another character orbiting around their sun. This is where the real psychological blow lands. When they wake up to the fact that you're not just another player on their stage, but the central figure they actually depended on, emotionally, psychologically, even existentially, they are forced into contact with the one thing they fear most, their own fragility. From a psychological standpoint, this moment is fascinating. Narcissists operate on what's often called a false self, a carefully constructed persona that shields them from feelings of inadequacy, shame, or vulnerability. This false self thrives on admiration, control, dominance, and a kind of emotional parasitism. But when you remove yourself from the equation, when you step back, reclaim your space, and become the unresponsive or absent figure they cannot manipulate, you rupture that false self. It's like pulling the keystone out of an arch. Suddenly, the entire structure begins to wobble. The narcissist, who once believed they could take or leave you at will, finds themselves haunted by an unbearable truth. You mattered. And not in the way they told themselves, as a trophy, a servant, a mirror to their ego, but as a unique, irreplaceable human being whose presence filled a void they didn't even consciously acknowledge. Now, let's be very clear here. This realization is not necessarily redemptive. Narcissists do not typically transform under the weight of this recognition. More often they rage, they panic, they scheme. They might launch frantic attempts to hoover you back in, or they might spiral into depressive collapse. But at the core of it all is the undeniable fact that they underestimated you, and in doing so, they underestimated their own need. This is a profound psychological moment. It exposes the lie they've lived by, that they are self-sufficient, above needing anyone, that people are merely tools or accessories to their personal narrative. The shattering of that illusion forces them to confront an ancient and universal human truth, that we are all, in the end, dependent on the quality of our connections. From a philosophical perspective, this is where the narcissist's tragedy unfolds. They've spent so much energy crafting a world where they reign supreme, only to find that supremacy is empty if it isolates them. They cannot bear to face the loneliness they've created, yet they cannot easily surrender the ego that maintains that loneliness. And when you, the one person who perhaps saw them fully and offered genuine connection, walk away, they are left not only with the loss of you, but with the collapse of their own narrative. That's what cuts the deepest. Not the loss of control, not even the loss of admiration, but the confrontation with their own smallness. They finally see that they cannot bend the world to their will forever. And that realization shakes them to the core. And so we're left with a striking paradox. The narcissist, who builds their entire identity on appearing untouchable, is ultimately shattered not by attack, but by absence, by the quiet, uncompromising withdrawal of the one they cannot live without. Let's dig into something even more subtle but equally powerful. The moment when the narcissist realizes that their usual tactics, the ones they've relied on for years, no longer work on you. You see, for a narcissist, control is like oxygen. It's not just about dominating a conversation or getting their way in a disagreement. It's about ensuring that they are the gravitational center of your emotional world. They need your attention, your reactions, your validation, even your anger. But what happens when that cycle breaks? When you stop playing the game, when the narcissist reaches for their usual tools, guilt trips, silent treatments, love bombing, or manufactured crises, and you no longer respond as expected, they experience something akin to an internal collapse. This is where it gets psychologically interesting. Narcissists survive by drawing people into their web of emotional manipulation. They thrive on predictability. They poke, you react. They withhold, you chase. They praise, you soften. It's a conditioned loop, one they've often perfected over years, sometimes decades. But when you break that loop, when you meet their provocations with calm, indifference, or detached clarity, you disrupt the very mechanism they rely on to stabilize their false self. Now, here's where most people misunderstand the narcissist. We often think they're merely arrogant, full of themselves, or overconfident, but beneath that surface lies something fragile and brittle. Their ego is inflated precisely because it's hollow. They need constant external reinforcement to keep the structure standing. So when you no longer provide that reinforcement, they are forced to face something they've spent their whole lives avoiding: the void within. Philosophically, this moment is a profound unmasking. The narcissist is suddenly alone with themselves, and they don't like what they see. The persona they've crafted, the grandiosity they project, relies on an audience. Remove the audience, and the performance falls apart. And here's the kicker. The narcissist often doesn't have a solid inner core to fall back on. This is why your refusal to engage is so powerful. It's not just passive resistance. It's an existential blow. You are in effect saying, I see through this. I refuse to play this game. I am no longer orbiting around your needs. That's a psychological death sentence to the narcissistic ego, because it reveals a truth they cannot tolerate, that their power over you was always conditional, always dependent on your participation. And notice something deeper here. Your withdrawal is not just about punishing them or getting revenge. It's about reclaiming your own sovereignty. It's about recognizing that your worth is not defined by their approval or their attention. When you stand firm in that recognition, you shift the entire dynamic. You are no longer the anxious responder, the desperate peacemaker, or the endlessly forgiving partner. You become instead a free agent, someone who no longer feeds their distorted self-image. From a psychological standpoint, this is what truly rattles a narcissist, the realization that they are not essential to your existence. And that realization forces them to confront another unbearable truth, that they need you far more than you need them. This is why you often see narcissists react with rage, panic, or desperate charm when they sense they're losing control. They might suddenly shower you with affection, make sweeping promises, or flip into victim mode. But beneath all of it is the same raw fear, the fear of losing the one person who gave their illusion substance. Without you, they are left with themselves. And for the narcissist, that's often an unbearable encounter. What does this mean for you? It means that your quiet strength, your refusal to be baited, your calm disconnection, these are not small acts. They are deeply disruptive to the narcissistic psyche. You are, without lifting a finger, exposing the hollowness they've been hiding from, perhaps even from themselves. And here's the philosophical punchline. True power is not in domination, but in self-possession. The narcissist spends their life trying to dominate others because they lack mastery over themselves. But when you master yourself, when you govern your own emotions, define your own worth, and refuse to be controlled, you become untouchable in a way they cannot comprehend. So remember this. The most profound defeat you can deliver to a narcissist is not through confrontation or revenge, but through the quiet, unshakable realization that you are free and that they no longer hold the keys to your inner life. That realization, more than any argument or punishment, shatters their illusion of control. And it leaves them facing the one adversary they can never escape, their own emptiness. Let's turn now to something that cuts even deeper. The way setting clear, unshakable boundaries disarms a narcissist's control mechanisms. Now, we throw the word boundaries around a lot these days, almost to the point where it sounds like self-help jargon. But let me tell you, from both a psychological and philosophical perspective, boundaries are not just rules you set. They are profound declarations of your own sovereignty. And for the narcissist, encountering someone with real, consistent boundaries is like slamming into an invisible wall they cannot manipulate, bend, or tear down. You see, narcissists operate through testing. They test how much they can push you, how far they can twist you, how often they can violate your emotional space without consequence. It's like a child testing the limits of a parent's patience, only far more sophisticated and often far more destructive. They do this not necessarily out of some conscious, villainous plan, but because at their core, they do not recognize the separateness of others in the way healthy minds do. In their psychological world, people exist as extensions of their own needs and desires. So when you draw a line, when you say this is where you stop and where I begin, you're not just setting a practical limit, you're making a philosophical statement. You are saying, I am not yours to consume. And that, for the narcissist, is a deeply unsettling realization. And let me make this clear. Narcissists do not respect boundaries unless they are enforced. In fact, they often take boundaries as an invitation to test harder. If you say, please don't call me late at night, they might deliberately do just that, not necessarily because they care about the call, but because they care about the power involved in crossing that line. So the key here isn't just setting boundaries, it's standing by them with unwavering consistency. Psychologically, why does this matter? Because narcissists are masters of identifying weakness. They watch closely, they listen carefully, and they note every hesitation, every self-doubt, every moment where your no could become a yes if they just push hard enough. But when you remove the possibility of manipulation, when your boundaries are clear, calm, and non-negotiable, you take away the game. You are no longer a reactive player in their psychological theater. You are an independent actor. Someone whose self-respect is not up for debate. This is where things get particularly interesting. Narcissists depend on a kind of psychic enmeshment where your emotions, your attention, and your identity become blurred with theirs. Strong boundaries shatter that illusion. They remind the narcissist over and over that you are a separate entity with your own mind, your own will, and your own values. And let me tell you, nothing terrifies them more. Because here's the deeper philosophical truth. A narcissist's greatest fear is not just rejection or abandonment, it's irrelevance. When you have strong boundaries, you signal that their tactics no longer dictate the terms of your emotional life. You signal that they are no longer the center of your world. And for someone whose ego is built entirely on external validation, that is a profound and destabilizing blow. Now, it's important to emphasize that boundary setting is not about cruelty or revenge. It's not about punishing the narcissist or trying to teach them a lesson, because frankly, that often leads to more entanglement. It's about preserving your own integrity, your own clarity, your own peace. You set boundaries not to control them, but to protect yourself. But the irony, the deep irony, is that in protecting yourself, you also deliver the narcissist one of the most powerful psychological wake-up calls they can experience. You show them by your actions that the world does not revolve around them, that there are people they cannot bend, cannot break, cannot manipulate, and in doing so, you force them, perhaps for the first time, to confront their own limitations This is not easy. There will be resistance. There will be escalation. Narcissists do not give up control quietly. But if you hold firm, if you stay grounded, you become something they cannot defeat. A person who knows where they stand and who refuses to surrender that ground for anyone. So here's the takeaway I want to leave you with. Boundaries are not just defensive tools. They are declarations of selfhood. And when you live by them, you don't just break the narcissist's control, you reclaim your own life. You remind both them and yourself that you are a sovereign being, not a prop in someone else's drama. And that, in the end, is the most powerful position you can hold. Let's turn now to something people often underestimate: the power of indifference, specifically emotional detachment. You see, when dealing with a narcissist, many assume that confrontation is the way forward, that if you can just explain or argue or emotionally unload all the pain they've caused, you'll somehow break through. But here's the psychological and philosophical truth. Narcissists thrive on emotional engagement. It doesn't matter whether it's positive or negative, admiration or outrage. What matters is that they are the center of your emotional world. And so, paradoxically, one of the most devastating things you can do to disrupt a narcissist's control is to withdraw your emotional energy entirely, to become, in essence, indifferent. Not in a cold, calculated way, but in a centered, self-possessed way. Because what narcissists feed on is not necessarily love or approval. It's attention, emotional attention. You can hate them, resent them, rage against them, and they will still feel empowered because you are still orienting yourself around them. When you detach emotionally, when you stop reacting, you send a message that cuts far deeper than any argument or confrontation ever could. You are saying, on a fundamental level, you no longer define my emotional landscape. That's an existential threat to the narcissist. It tells them they no longer hold the strings to your inner world, and for someone who thrives on control, that realization can be shattering. Now, why is this so effective? Because narcissists exist in a fragile equilibrium. They construct a grandiose self, imagine, the mask they wear to the world, but this image requires constant reinforcement. Every time you react, every time you explain or defend yourself, you're participating in the maintenance of that grandiose system. You're playing the role they've assigned to you, whether as admirer, subordinate, or even opponent. But emotional detachment removes you from the game entirely. You're no longer offering fuel, no longer validating their role in your life. And here's the fascinating part. When you do this consistently, the narcissist is forced to confront the emptiness behind the mask. Without someone mirroring their importance back to them, their carefully constructed identity begins to fracture. Philosophically, we could think of this as a confrontation with the void. Most people over time develop a sense of internal solidity, a coherent self that doesn't entirely depend on external approval. Narcissists, by contrast, remain trapped in a kind of mirror maze, needing others to reflect back their worth. When you stop holding up that mirror, they are left facing the terrifying possibility that there's nothing substantial underneath. It's important to clarify that emotional detachment is not about cruelty or passive aggression. It's not about punishing the narcissist by giving them the silent treatment or withdrawing affection as a power play. That still engages you in their game. True detachment comes from a place of clarity and self-respect. It's the calm realization that you do not owe them your constant emotional involvement. Of course, this is easier said than done. Emotional detachment requires enormous discipline, especially if the narcissist has been a central figure in your life, a partner, a parent, a long-term friend. There's a grief process involved. You're not just detaching from the narcissist, you are detaching from the fantasy that they will one day become the person you hope they could be. But once you cross that threshold, once you genuinely release the need to make them see you, validate you, or change for you, something extraordinary happens. You reclaim your psychological autonomy. You stop being pulled into their chaotic emotional orbit. And from that place of autonomy, you can make clear, grounded decisions. Decisions about how much contact you want, what kind of relationship is acceptable, and whether it's even worth maintaining. This is the paradox at the heart of emotional detachment. What feels on the surface like giving up is actually the most powerful form of taking control. Not control over the narcissist, that's impossible, but control over yourself, your mind, your emotions, your peace. And when you achieve that, when you stand in that place of quiet strength, you become someone the narcissist cannot manipulate, because you no longer give them access to the most vulnerable parts of you. So here's the closing thought I want to leave you with. Emotional detachment is not an act of coldness, it's an act of profound self-respect. It's the realization that your energy is sacred, that your peace is worth protecting, and that no one, no matter how demanding, charming, or relentless, has the right to consume your emotional life. When you step into that truth, you don't just break free from the narcissist's grip. You step into the full power of your own sovereignty. And that, in the end, is what shatters their illusion of control. There's a psychological maneuver that few people recognize as truly powerful when it comes to destabilizing a narcissist's grip. And that's the art of refusing to explain yourself. Now, on the surface, this sounds almost trivial. What's the big deal about not explaining yourself? But think carefully about what's embedded in the act of explanation. Every time you feel compelled to explain, to justify, to defend your motives, you are implicitly granting the other person the authority to judge you. You're placing yourself on trial, inviting them to be the judge, the jury, and the arbiter of your worth. And when you're dealing with a narcissist, that dynamic is like handing them the master key to your sense of self. Narcissists are master interrogators, not because they want the truth, but because they want control. They challenge you not to understand you, but to keep you tangled in a web of self-doubt and emotional exhaustion. They ask, why did you do that? Or don't you think you were being unfair? Or how could you say something like that to me? And instinctively you feel the pull to explain, to lay out your reasoning, to clarify your position, to prove that you're acting in good faith. But here's the trap. The more you explain, the more you surrender. You shift from being a person acting with autonomous intent to being a performer seeking approval. And the narcissist, seated comfortably in their self-appointed role as judge, will never truly validate you. They will move the goalposts, twist your words, and demand further explanation. The conversation will never end, because the point isn't resolution, the point is control. Refusing to explain yourself cuts directly through this power dynamic. It's an assertion not of aggression, but of sovereignty. It says, I know why I act. I know what my intentions are. I know where I stand. And I do not need your permission to exist in this way. That, for a narcissist, is deeply destabilizing, because it denies them the thing they crave most: psychological leverage. Now, let's look at this through a deeper lens. Philosophically, what we're talking about here is the distinction between internal and external loci of validation. A person with an external locus of validation looks outward. They need the applause, the approval, the acceptance of others to feel whole. A person with an internal locus, by contrast, acts in alignment with their values and principles, irrespective of external feedback. Narcissists, by nature, try to pull you into their orbit, where your sense of right and wrong, good and bad, is defined by their reactions. And so when you stop explaining yourself, you are not merely being stubborn or evasive. You are anchoring yourself firmly in an internal frame. You are saying, in essence, I will not outsource my self-definition to you. Practically, this might look like calmly stating your choice without apology. Or it might mean walking away from a circular conversation that goes nowhere. It might mean tolerating the discomfort of being misunderstood, and this is key, without scrambling to correct the record. That last part is often the hardest, because human beings are social creatures, wired to seek connection and clarity. But in the presence of a narcissist, the pursuit of clarity can become a trap. There's an old line from Viktor Frankl, the great psychologist and Holocaust survivor, that goes, between stimulus and response there is a space. And in that space lies our power to choose. Refusing to explain yourself is about claiming that space. It's about resisting the reflexive pull to justify, and instead acting from a place of conscious choice. It's also about recognizing that not every battle is worth fighting. You do not owe everyone an explanation for your boundaries, your decisions, or your emotions, especially not to someone who consistently uses your openness as a weapon against you. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is say nothing, not out of spite, but out of clarity. And this brings us to a larger truth. When you stop explaining yourself to a narcissist, you invite a kind of psychological collapse in their framework. They are left staring into a void they cannot fill. Your silence confronts them with their own emptiness, their own inability to control, to define, to possess you. And while they may lash out, manipulate, or attempt to provoke a reaction, your refusal to engage keeps the power where it belongs, with you. So here's what I want to leave you with. You do not owe the world, and certainly not a narcissist, an explanation for your existence. Your worth is not up for negotiation. Your boundaries are not debate topics. When you learn to act from that place of quiet inner conviction, you become untouchable. You reclaim the most fundamental freedom any human being can possess, the freedom to define yourself on your own terms without apology. And that, more than any argument or confrontation, is what truly shatters a narcissist's illusion of control.